Welcome, everyone, to Journeys Through the Books of the Prophets. We're in the Book of Yehoshua. For those who want to follow, we're going to begin on chapter 6 of the Book of Yehoshua. Tonight we have some, call them classic stories that appear in the Book of Yehoshua. The first one is the very well-known conquering of Jericho. If you remember, on the 10th of Nisan, we crossed the Jordan River. On the 11th of Nisan, Yehoshua does circumcision on all the men who needed it. On the 14th of Nisan, we brought the Paschal offering. And on the 15th of Nisan, we begin Pesach. And right after, we begin the circling of Jericho. God came to Yeshua and gave directions, strategy of how we were going to defeat Jericho. And of course, this is like a very, very famous story. And God said to Yeshua, and then Yeshua obviously gave it over to the people, that there would be 7 Kohanim, who each one would have a shofar. So 7 Kohanim and 7 shofars. And they would do one circle around Jericho each day. And the Kohanim would bring the Aron HaKodesh, the Holy Ark. And before the Kohanim, if you remember, the 2.5 tribes that wanted to inherit on the other side of the Jordan, but had promised that they would enter into the land with all of Israel and fight the wars. And when the wars were over, they would settle on the other side of the Jordan. That was Reuben and Gad and half of the tribe of Manasseh. So they went first. We'll call it a procession. The 2.5 tribes, and we learned already there were 40,000 soldiers from these 2.5 tribes. They went before the 7 Kohanim with the 7 shofars and the Holy Ark. And then all the other soldiers followed. And they made one circle around Jericho, and the Kohanim blew the shofars. And that was it for one day. They did this for 6 days, the exact same procedure for 6 days. And on the 7th day, they went around 7 times. And the Kohanim were blowing the shofar. And Yeshua commanded them, all the people, not a peep out of you for the first 6 days. In other words, only the Kohanim blowing these 7 shofars. And then on the 7th day, Yeshua said, when you've gone around 7 times and the shofars have been blown, you can only imagine this. We're talking about, I don't know the number, but tens of thousands of armed soldiers. Everyone was supposed to yell at the same time. And what's interesting is that in the Hebrew, the word is teruah, which is one of the 3 sounds of the shofar, which is do 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 do. That's the sound of the teruah. But here, it was with people's voices, and it didn't mean that they had to make that staccato sound. It just meant that everyone had to shout like at the top of their lungs all at once. And God said the miracle would be that the walls would tumble down. And this is exactly what happened. This is exactly what happened. And it's explained in the Mamlo Ez that you can imagine, let's say you have a high wall. And if the walls crumbled, whether they fell this way or that way, well, how are the soldiers then going to get into the city? And so we always hear that the walls came tumbling down. That's the famous song. But the Mamloes explains that it was more that the walls sunk into the ground. They sunk into the ground so that the soldiers would be able just to head right into the city. So it's a little bit different than what we think. But when you think about it, it's very logical that if these huge stones, there were high walls. You can imagine, let's say, the wall around Jerusalem, the old city of Jerusalem. If all of those came down, there'd be tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of stones that the soldiers would have to manipulate around in order to even get into the city. So that's how the Mamloes explains it. It was more the sinking of the walls. Now, of course, this was miraculous. The whole thing was miraculous and was meant to be miraculous. So one very, very important thing is, if you heard my description or you read the description, it should remind us of something. It should remind us of something that just happened not that long ago. On Sukkot, how many times do we go around the bima each day of Sukkah? One time. Each day we go around one time. But what happens on the seventh day, which is called Hosana Raba? We go around 7 times. And I think I mentioned that in many Hasidic communities, if you remember, Hosana Raba is like the climax of all the days from not just Rosh Hashanah, but all the way back to Rosh Chodesh Elul. And we'll call it the final climax, of course, is Shmini Atzeret and Simchas Torah, where what do we do all day long? Our hakafot. Technically 7. Each hakafot we go around many, many, many times. But on Hosana Raba, we only go around 7 times. And at the end of each of the hakafas in Hasidic communities, we blow the shofar. And so this is like an amazing correspondence between the defeat, conquering Jericho, and how we actually celebrate Sukkot. So the obvious connection is, even though we think of, and there is a reality to, Ne'ilah and Yom Kippur being the final sealing of our judgment, especially of the 10 days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, Aseret Yemei HaTshuvah, the 7 days of repentance. But we're told that that is the initial sealing of the judgment. The final one happens, excuse me, on Hosana Raba. And so the correspondence here is that we're told on Hosana Raba, if there are any walls that still stand between us and God, that stand between us and our own neshama, our own souls, if there are any obstacles that we have not been able to get through psychologically, emotionally, intellectually, spiritually, Hosana Raba is like the walls of Jericho coming down. It's an incredible correspondence. So anyone who, if you read chapter 6 in the Book of Yehoshua, and then you compare it to how we do Sukkot and Hosana Raba, and then Simchas Torah, again with the Hakafot, is spiritually the idea of whatever walls remain, now is the time to take them down. So that's just a very, very amazing idea. Another very, very important idea here is that according to tradition, the seventh day of circling Jericho was on Shabbat. So this leaves an obvious question in a certain way. Why are we fighting a war on Shabbat? And the answer is that according to halacha, that if you're in a war situation, remember we just entered Eretz Yisrael. We were already told in the Book of Yehoshua that all the kings were well aware that Israel had just crossed the Jordan, and we're also well aware that Israel's intent was to conquer the land of Israel and to settle it. And so it was from day one, it was a war situation. And we see this recently when Israel struck back at Iran after Iran had attacked us. We did it on Shabbat, and halakhically it was permitted. It was permitted because if you're in a war situation, of course, it's not ideal, obviously, but in a war situation, the laws about keeping Shabbat are transcended by the war situation. Usually in Israel, it's a Jewish country, and it's a Jewish army. And as I mentioned, I was in the Israeli army, and I was in the army many times on Shabbat. And the amazing thing is, on Shabbat, the army really makes every attempt to keep the laws of Shabbat as much as possible. And therefore, almost all the soldiers, now we're talking about peacetime, even though there's always the possibility of war and terrorism in Israel, always. But in general, if it's, let's say, a more peaceful time, almost all the soldiers are sent home for Shabbat. Only a skeleton crew is kept on bases all over Israel. And 3 Shabbat meals are served to everyone. Not everyone goes to services, but 3 Shabbat services with Kiddush and 2 loaves of bread and special foods for everyone, even if it's a base that hardly anyone is religious. So in peacetime, the army really, is actually quite amazing, makes every attempt to keep Shabbat as much as possible. So that's one idea. The other is, I think most people know that we pray 3 times a day, and every prayer service ends with the Elenu prayer. Elenu l'shabeach la'adon hakol. It's upon us to give praise to the master of everything. Every prayer service, doesn't matter if it's during the week, if it's Shabbat, if it's Rosh Hashanah, if it's Yom Kippur, doesn't matter. Every prayer service ends with Alenu. According to tradition, Yehoshua composed Alenu on the very day that the walls of Jericho came down. He composed the first half. Well, if you look at the Elenu, any prayer book, it's actually, we'll call it two paragraphs, two passages. According to tradition, Yeshua composed that on the very day that Jericho was defeated. And we're going to see soon who wrote the second passage of Alenu. But it's so good to know where some of our prayers come from. So the Elenu is really one of the most important prayers. And it's explained that in a lot of communities, it's after a long prayer service, whether it's morning or Shabbat or Rosh Hashanah. And a lot of people by Elenu are taking off their talit, are taking off their tefillin, are getting ready to walk out the door. And so sometimes it's thought that the Elenu, which is really a summary of Jewish mission in the world. And so it's said that because of this, the Elenu was put in Musaf of Rosh Hashanah and Musaf of Yom Kippur, and we literally bow down to the ground on those 2 days. During the rest of the year, we just bow at the knee, at the waist, during one part of the Elenu. But because sometimes the Elenu is not given its full respect, it was placed in Musaf of Rosh Hashanah, Musaf of Yom Kippur, which are such incredibly climactic prayers. And we actually get down on hands and knees during the Elenu on those 2 days to give the Elenu its full due. Chapter 6 continues that as part of the conquest of Jericho, and we have to understand, Jericho was, in that time, was one of the major cities of Eretz Yisrael. And it was considered like the entrance point, that not just that Israel happened to cross the Jordan in those days, but it was part of, very connected to the spice trade and the different routes. So Jericho was a huge city then, and was also one of the most ancient cities in the world, is Jericho. And so it wasn't just like a little conquest. It was like the doorway into Eretz Yisrael. And even Jericho is very close to the Jordan River to this day. It's really right there. And so if we remember that when Joshua sent 2 spies to spy out the land, they were hidden by a woman named Rachav. And this we went over, so I'm not going to go into it in depth. But because she hid the 2 spies, and she sent the king really in the wrong direction, chasing after them. So she really protected them. And in exchange, she asked that her and her family be saved, because she understood Israel was going to conquer Jericho and all of Eretz Yisrael. And that is what happened in chapter 6 as part of the conquest. So Joshua orders the soldiers to make sure that Rachav and her family, and how did they know? Because remember, she lived right on the walls of Jericho. And the sign was that she hung a red piece of material from her window. And that's how they knew where she was. And she was told, you have to gather your whole family together to that one place, or we're not going to be able to know who's who. And that's what she did. And she was saved. At the end, and also as part of chapter 6, we see that Joshua commanded the people, they were not allowed to take any of what is called the booty. in Hebrew, the shalal. In other words, they couldn't take anything from any possessions, and any gold, silver, iron, or copper vessels that they found, they could take, and it was contributed to the Mishkan. And that the Kohanim and the Levim would use those metals in the service of God. But no private booty could be taken. And Joshua was very, very clear about this. There's a question whether, because it doesn't say explicitly that God said to Joshua, tell the people they cannot take any of the booty. It's given over as Yeshua is telling them. But there's a question whether this was Yeshua's initiative or it was coming from God. And there are different opinions. Can't say that we really know either way. There are two different opinions. I would say the majority opinion is that it was Joshua's own initiative. And the question is, why was there this initiative? And so one of the reasons was that it's very likely that many of the private possessions were used in one way or another in different forms of idol worship. And so Joshua didn't want Israel to have any possibility of having those kind of things. The gold and silver and copper and iron vessels, so the Kohanim and the Levim would deal with them. They would like fix any spiritual energy that went with them. We're going to see how important this is in the next chapter. And then the chapter ends with Yeshua, in a certain way, putting a curse on anyone who would rebuild the city of Jericho. In other words, this great miracle that happened, Joshua wanted the ruins of Jericho. Now some of the walls protruded from where they sunk in. And Joshua wanted this to be like an everlasting remembrance of the great miracle that happened there. And he put a curse on anyone who would rebuild Jericho. Now, I'm going to mention this now because it's a fascinating story. And I really don't know how many books of the prophets we're going to get through. But in the book of Kings, there's a very, very important story that's connected to this curse that Yeshua put on it. I'm going to tell it in very brief. If we get to the book of Malachim, it could be next year. I don't know. We'll say it again. But there's a very, very famous story, is that there was a person named Chiel. And he and his sons rebuilt the city of Jericho, despite the fact that it was known that there was this curse from Yeshua on anyone who would rebuild it. And he thought he was being very clever. Jericho, in Hebrew, Jericho, ends with a vav. Jericho, with a vav. He changed it, the last letter, from a vav to a hey. And he thought, well, I'm changing the name, so the curse won't apply to me. What happened, though, his son started to die, to the point that he understood, I think I blew it, because his sons died. And so he was an important person in Israel at the time. And the king of the northern kingdom, Achav, he went to visit, to do a condolence call. And God commanded Elijah the prophet to also go. And Eliyahu didn't want to go. Why would I want to go? He went against this command of Yeshua. Why would I want to go there? God just said, go. So he went, and the king went. And the king turned to Elijah, Eliyahu Navi, and said, Joshua is greater than Moshe. David, listen to what I'm saying here. Joshua is greater than Moshe. Why? Because Joshua put a curse on the city. And again, the idea is that God didn't tell Yeshua to put a curse on anyone who would rebuild the city. It came apparently from Joshua. Now we have to understand, Joshua was now on the level of prophecy. He was considered a prophet, and he had Ruach HaKodesh, he had divine inspiration. And so it's brought in the Midrash that there are 3 incidences where a person made like a halachic decision, and the heavenly court agreed with them. It's not like these are the only 3 times, but this particular Midrash points out 3 times. One is right here, that it came from Yeshua, this idea of anyone who rebuilds Jericho. But we're told that the heavenly court agreed with him, that this was a good idea, Yeshua. The second incident is with Ezra. When Ezra came back and led people from Bavel and Persia, very few people actually came. I believe it was around 40,000 people, which was very few people at the time. The Jewish community at that point in Persia and Babylonia was huge. And there was a whole question, like what laws of Eretz Yisrael would they be able to fulfill? And Ezra commanded that we start taking Truma and Meiser, tithing, as if we were now the custodians of Eretz Yisrael again. Now, there's a whole question whether that was maybe premature, but it's brought down that he made this decision and the heavenly court agreed with him. And the third time, according to this Midrash, is after the miracle of Purim. And Esther wanted to, and it's actually in the Megillah, that she wanted to write down this whole story for all time. And the rabbis were not happy with this, because they felt, even though it was a tremendous miracle what happened, we were still living under the rule of Achashverosh, and we were still in exile. And the rabbis felt that if we tell this story too publicly, it might rile up the Babylonians and the Persians. And Esther argued differently. She said, it's already a known fact. The Persians have already written in their records. And she got her way. That's why we have Megillat Esther. And we're told that the heavenly court agreed with her. So now I'm going back to what the king Achav says to Eliyahu. He says, Joshua is greater than Moshe. Why? Because Joshua on his own proclaimed this curse. And here we see it was manifest. But Moshe in the Torah, like for example, in the second passage of the Shema, which we say every day, it says that if you don't listen to God and you don't do the mitzvot and you turn away from God and worship idols, God will stop up the heavens and there'll be no rain and you will be exiled. And so Achav said to Eliyahu, here, I worship idols. Most people in Israel are worshiping idols, and we have plenty of rain, and we're prospering. And so Eliyahu, on his own, said, I will show you now that you're wrong. Unless I command for the rain to fall, there will be no more rain in Eretz Israel. And this is part of a whole story. And what happened is for 3 years, there was no rain in Eretz Israel. And then there's a whole continuation of this story that I'm not going to tell right now. But this is such an interesting thing because it's based on this chapter in Yeshua, this curse of those who rebuild the city of Jericho. So that's chapter 6. I'm going to go a little bit faster now. And chapter 7, what happens is like this, that it actually begins, the first verse of chapter 7, it says that God was with Yeshua. God was with Yeshua, and then God commands him to now conquer the city of Ai. This was also one of the biggest cities in Israel at the time. It wasn't so much it was big, but it was strategic. It was in a strategic place. It's mentioned that when Avram Avinu first came to Israel, that he came to this place called Ai, and he passed it a number of times. It was a very strategic place, more up north, where the city of Shechem is. And so God commands him to conquer that city next. So Yeshua sends spies again, and they come back and say, it's a very strategic place, but it's not a very big place. We don't really need to send the entire army there. We should just send 3,000 men, and they will be able to conquer the city. So Yeshua listened to them, and he didn't go with them. And they went, and the people of Ai defended themselves, and 36 Jews were killed. And they retreated, and they came back to camp, and they told Yeshua what happened. And it says Yeshua tore his clothes, and he fell on the ground in mourning. And he says, God, what happened here? What happened? You told us to conquer Ai. After the miracles of crossing the Jordan and Jericho, what happened here? What went wrong? And then God reveals that someone took booty. Even though they were commanded not to take any booty, someone took booty. And so then the question is, and then the whole 7th chapter is this whole story of this one person. His name was Achan. One person took some very valuable, we'll call it jewelry, and hid it, and no one knew about it. And so this becomes a classic example of one of the most important principles in Judaism is Kol Yisrael Aravin Zelazeh. All of Israel is responsible one for the other. And here, in a sense, all of Israel was punished. The army was defeated. People were killed. All because this one person took booty that they weren't supposed to do. And this because it's an extreme case of all of Israel is responsible one for the other. But still, sometimes we learn from extreme cases, what is called kal v'chomer, like lighter cases. It could be the opposite. You learn from a light case, how much more so a heavy case. But here we learn that all of Israel in a certain way suffered because of this one person's sin. So this chapter explains that, and there's two different opinions. Well, how did they know who took it? So one opinion is that they asked the Urim Tumim, the special oracle that the high priest wore on the what's called the Choshen Mishpat, the breastplate. There was a pocket and had in it secret names of God. And by asking it questions, the stones would light up, and there were letters on the stones, and they would show answers to questions that had to do with all of Israel. So some say that that's how they narrowed down who it was. They went from tribe to tribe. Is the person who took it in this tribe? No. They went and the other opinion is they did it by lottery. They threw lots. Is it this tribe? And if the lots came out, yes or no. In short, though, it came to the tribe of Yehuda, of Judah. And then it went family by family until it isolated Achan. And Yeshua comes to Achan. Again, whether it was done through the Urim and Tumim or by lottery, it was narrowed down to this one individual. So Yeshua comes and says, my son, just tell us what you did. Just admit it. He didn't come down really hard on him. He just said, admit what you've done. And so it's explained that why did Achan take this booty? So the simple understanding is he thought he could get away with it. The jewelry was worth a lot of money, and his desire for money overcame him. But there's a little bit more complicated, is that he questioned Yeshua's proclamation. Because remember, we learned that this came from Yeshua. It wasn't straight from God. And so he questioned, why do you have the right to decide that? Because it says in the Torah, in the book of Devarim, that when you conquer Eretz Yisrael, you will eat the booty of your enemies. And so he said, what right does someone have to come and overturn what the Torah says? And so in a certain way, in his mind, you have to remember that most people, when they do wrong, they find a way to justify it. Now, it's true. Many times we do wrong and we know that we're doing wrong and it's clear to us. But other times the mind can play real tricks on us and can justify just about anything. So Achan justified that the one proclamation from Yeshua doesn't overturn what it says in the Torah itself. But here we learn something because, as I mentioned, Yeshua is now on the level of being a prophet. He has clear Ruach HaKodesh, and according to Jewish law, a prophet in certain circumstances can overturn a law of the Torah for a particular time and reason. But it can't overturn a law forever, but can in certain circumstances. And Yeshua really felt that Jericho was steeped in idol worship and didn't want the people to have any benefit from anything that was used in idol worship. And so in the end, Achan admitted what he did. He admitted what he did. And at that point, he accepted that he was going to be punished, and God said that it was really a death penalty, and that is what happened in the end. Now, I mentioned before that Yeshua composed the first half of Alenu. Now, the amazing thing is that Achan did real tshuva. It wasn't that he said, okay, you caught me, I'll admit it. He actually did real tshuva, and he accepted upon himself punishment. And Yeshua said, your tshuva is accepted, and you, in a certain way, you have a place in the world to come because you've admitted your mistake. According to tradition, Achan composes the second part of Elenu, which is really startling. But here we see that he did true tshuva. And this just shows that when a person does true tshuva, that in a certain way their slate is wiped clean. And so a hint to this is that the second passage of Elenu begins, Al Kain Nikaveh, and therefore we hope. And then it continues that God will do away with all idol worship, and the whole world will come to accept one God and will acknowledge God together. And we end the Elenu with what later Zechariah would write, that on that day, when everyone in the world acknowledges God, God will be one and his name will be one. And so if you look at the first three words, Al Kain Nikaveh, the first letter spells out Achan. Ayin Chaf Nun. Achan. That's like the hint that he composed the second passage. So that's really an amazing thing. That's really an amazing thing. And then at the end of chapter, Right, and that's how chapter 7 ends. We're going to do chapter 8, because if we continue going this slowly, we'll be on the Book of Yehoshua for a long time. And so chapter 8, really almost the whole chapter talks about another incident that happens. And I'm not going to go into it in depth, but it's a very interesting thing. I should have mentioned that in the beginning of chapter 8, now that the whole thing with the booty is settled, they go back and they conquer Ai. But this time, Yeshua leads them, and they take the whole army, and they defeat the city of Ai. And then at the end of chapter 8, I've mentioned this before, and it's very important, that already in the Book of Yehoshua, there's a number of incidences, and sometimes you wouldn't know. If you're reading it in Hebrew or English without any commentary, you would think it's totally a linear history here. But I already mentioned that certain of the verses are what's called Ein Muktam V'Muchar b'Torah. There's no beginning and before and after in the Torah. In other words, not everything in the Torah is chronological. Sometimes something is given over, and it actually happened already, but it's only being mentioned there for various reasons. So here, after they take the city of Ai, it's explained in some detail how they go to the two mountains, Har Grizim and Har Eival, which are mentioned in the Book of Devarim, that when we come into the land of Israel, we are to go to these two mountains and build an altar and to write out the whole Torah in 70 languages on 12 huge stones, and that 6 of the tribes climbed one mountain, the other 6 climbed the other mountain. The Kohanim and the Levim were in the middle. Part of the Levim were on one of the mountain, but a contingent of Levim were in the middle with the Mishkan, and there they made a covenant with God for entering into the land. It's not a new covenant; it's a renewal of a number of covenants that have been made since the time of Avram. But here it's that Israel is now in the land of Israel, and it's called the blessing and the curse. And all of this is written in the Parshat Ki Tavo, in the Book of Devarim, in great detail. But here, in the end of chapter 8, it says that after they defeated Ai, they went and they did this whole blessing and curse, that the Kohanim and the Levim would turn to one mountain, and there was a series of blessings. Blessed is the one who, and then a whole fill in the blank. And then they would turn to the other mountain. The mountain of blessing was Grizim. The mountain of curse was Eival. But again, this is symbolic. And then they turned to Har Grizim and said, blessed is the one who, and then they would turn and say, cursed is the one who. And they go through 11 different blessings and curses, and they built this altar, and they established these stones. But it's explained that this is not the proper place that it happened. It happened already right after we crossed the Jordan. That it was actually bordering on a miracle, that they went all the ways up to Har Eival and Grizim. They did all of this in one day, and then they came back to the camp in Gilgal. So the question is, what is it doing here in the 8th chapter? And so one of the answers is because Ai, the city of Ai, is very close to Har Grizim and Har Eival. So you would think, logically, that's when this whole incident happened. Nonetheless, the commentaries told us, no, it happened already. But it's placed here because strategically, the locations are very near to each other. And that is the end of chapter 8. And this is, again, I didn't get into detail, but if you want to read, go to Parshat Ki Tavo in the Book of Devarim, where it gives all the details of this really very symbolic covenant that is made as Israel enters into the land. And remember, this is not just after 40 years of wandering in the desert. This is going back all the ways to Abraham, who was told that your descendants would be enslaved, and they would go through 400 years. It turns out it was less. We were in Egypt for 210 years, and then 40 years in the desert. So 250 years before, approximately, Avram was already promised the land of Israel. So here we finally, after 250 years, we are now in Eretz Yisrael, all of Israel, and beginning the conquest and the settling of Eretz Yisrael. So that's how chapter 8 ends, and that will be it for tonight.